And now I would like to introduce today's speaker. We have Dr. Katharina Ullmann. Dr. Ullmann is a training and technical assistance coordinator at the University of California Organic Agriculture Institute. Today she's going to be speaking about the ecology and management of squash bees. So Katharina, you can go ahead and share your slides.
Hi, everyone. I'm just pulling up my slide share right now. And thanks so much for that introduction, Cheryl. And thanks to you all for taking the time to be here today. I'm very happy to be able to spend some time with you all to talk about squash bees. As Cheryl said, my name is Katharina Ullmann. I work as the Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator for the UC Organic Agriculture Institute, or OAI. And OAI does research, education, and extension to support aspiring, transitioning, and certified organic producers. And if you want to learn more about OAI or connect with us, Cheryl's going to be adding information into the chat box to link to our website. But today, for right now, I'm going to talk about some research I did for my PhD and summarize some of the research out there related to squash bees. And I want to start by just acknowledging that farming is not a simple endeavor. As farmers or growers on this call, you're aware that you're always considering risks and trade-offs when making decisions, integrating a lot of different information. I'll be talking about squash bees today, which I think can and do play really important roles on some farms in the state, and hope that what I share will give you some new information to consider when managing your farm. So why talk about bees and wild bees specifically in an IPM seminar series? IPM, as you know, is a way of thinking about pest management, especially all the PCAs and farmers out there, where you all know this, where chemical controls are used as a last resort, and instead farmers are encouraged to use cultural controls, many of which are based on agroecological principles. But pollinators aren't explicitly considered within this framework, even though they can play really important roles in production, and they can even be negatively impacted by choices along this IPM continuing. Conversely, uh, efforts to support pollinators can have different impacts on both natural enemies and pests. Additionally, we know that pest damage and pollination don't act in isolation. In fact, there's a study from Indiana showing that pollination can offset pest damage in watermelon when considering cucumber beetles. But ultimately, the extent to which pollination can offset pest damage will really depend on your cropping system, your region, your pollination levels, and pest pressure. Still, this is an interesting study to keep in mind. Because of the ways that pests, natural enemies, and pollinators overlap, some extension professionals and researchers have proposed the idea of integrated pest and pollinator management. And this framework expands upon the IPM framework by incorporating pollinators, explicitly acknowledging the ecological and management overlap between insect pests, natural enemies, and pollinators, and also explicitly considering landscape management considerations. It also emphasizes the importance of using proactive, preventative agroecological measures before moving on to more reactive approaches to pest and pollinator management. And finally, why talk about bees in an IPM seminar, especially wild bees? If you're a certified organic grower or producer on the call, you know that the National Organic Program considers conserving biodiversity as part of the definition for organic agriculture, and keeping track of and supporting wild bees on your farm can be part of your biodiversity record keeping plan. So in this talk today, I'm going to give a really high level overview of California crop pollination, and then we'll go into squash bee ecology and some squash bee management considerations. As you know, California leads production in the nation on many crops, and some of those crops depend on animal pollinators. So those are crops like almond and blueberries, the seed produced in the state, like this hybrid sunflower seed, and strawberries. There are many additional crops with smaller acreage that are still really important to California growers and the markets that they support, and that also benefit from animal crop pollination. So some examples here include raspberries, peaches, watermelon, and squashes and pumpkin. So who's doing the pollination in California? The European honeybee Apis mellifera is an important crop pollinator, if not the most important in some regions and crops in California. It's a really good pollinator at most crops. It's a social bee that we know how to manage and move around in really large numbers, which means that we can drop it at the edge of a crop field when it's in bloom and remove it at the end of bloom. So this is a really important pollinator in California. We also have a lot of other bees in California that can contribute to crop pollination. Um, in fact, we have an estimated 1,600 species of bees in California, and I'll say that again. So we have 1,600 species of wild native bees in California, many of which are found pollinating crops grown across the state. Global analyses looking at the role of wild crop pollinators on farms has shown that wild native bees can enhance fruit set even when honeybees are present. And this particular research study included a number of data sets from California that you can see on the map here. These authors also noted that often optimal pollination came from a combination of both wild native bees and honeybees. One interesting story from California comes from almonds. And this study showed that wild bees can make honeybees better pollinators in almond because the wild bees make the honeybees move more between the pollinizer row and the main crop row. And that also ultimately leads to higher nut set on those farms that have enough of these wild bees. Another study in California looking at watermelon showed that if you have enough wild native bees, you can get all of your crop pollination needs taken care of by those wild bees in farms that had a lot of natural habitat around their fields. So things like rangeland or hedgerows or riparian areas, those farms could actually have enough wild bees to complete watermelon pollination on their farms. One exception to this relationship between number of wild bees on the farm and the amount of natural habitat is the squash bees, which we'll talk about today, but they didn't exactly follow this pattern related to amount of natural habitat around the field. So, what about squash and pumpkin pollination? So, the squashes and pumpkins that we grow, summer squash, hard squashes, pumpkin cultivars, are all in the genus Cucurbita, and they come from three main species: Cucurbita maxima, Cucurbita machata, and Cucurbita pepo. And for the most part, these cucurbita species, these squash and pumpkin crops, produce male and female flowers. They're monoecious. Another interesting thing about this crop is that the flowers are only open for one full morning, so they have a pretty short pollination window. They're essentially open around dawn and then wilt around midday. And during those morning hours, bees need to move the heavy, sticky pollen from the male flowers to the female flowers in order for the crop to set fruit. So, who do we find visiting squash and pumpkin flowers in California? Research that I and collaborators did in Northern California in Yolo County found these bees on our squash and pumpkin fields that we sampled. Green sweat bees or Agapostemon species, tiny dark bees or Dialictus species, carpenter bees or Xylocopa species, bumblebees or bombus species, and then our squash bees and honeybees. And of all these different groups of bees, the squash bees and the honeybees were the most common. Now, in California, there are three different types of squash bees you might find visiting squash and pumpkin. These are called squash bees because they are specialists on squash and pumpkin, collecting pollen from those species to bring back to feed their young. If you're in the southernmost part of California, you might find Xenoglossa strenua. If you're a little bit further north into the valley, you might also see Xenoglossa angustior. There's a specimen, I think, from Tuliar County. And then across the state, you should come in contact with a bee called Xenoglossa pruinosa. And this bee, I just want to mention, used to be called Peponapis pruinosa. A taxonomic revision then changed its name to Eucera pruinosa. If you heard Dr. Willis Chan's talk, that's the name she would have used. More recently, another taxonomic revision decided that the official categorization of this bee is actually Xenoglossa pruinosa. So if you're looking across the internet and see any of these three names, species names, all of them relate to the same squash bee. And this is the squash bee that we find in our region in Northern California. For this presentation, when I use the word squash bee moving forward, I'm only going to be referring to this particular species, Xenoglossa pruinosa, the one with the widest distribution in California and the one found in Yolo County. So this particular squash bee, like the other squash bees, is a specialist on Cucurbita species. So it'll only visit squash and pumpkin flowers for pollen. It may visit other plants for nectar, but it's really dependent on our squashes and pumpkins. It produces one generation a year, and based on the size of its body, we think that it can fly about a mile. Squash bees are solitary bees, so they're very different from honeybees, which, as you know, are these social bees. Squash bees are solitary bees where they're female. There's one adult female actively building the nest and collecting pollen and nectar to feed her young. It's just the mother doing all that work. These bees are ground nesting bees, and they actually spent most of their life below ground, developing from egg to larva to pupa to prepupa before they emerge and spend a very small part of their life as an adult above ground. They prefer to nest under or near Cucurbita species, and they can form really, really large aggregations. So when you're looking for nests, and we'll talk about that later, you might end up finding areas, especially undisturbed areas, where you can just find a huge, huge number of bees nesting in the same area. And those bees can persist from year to year in those aggregations if their nesting sites are not disturbed. So are squash bees and honeybees effective pollinators? Back in the 1980s, Tepedino did a study on this, comparing honeybees against squash bees, and found when he looked at percent fruit developed that these bees were pretty comparable in how good they were at pollination and at pollinating squash and pumpkin. And later studies suggested you might need between 5 and 7 visits of one of these bees to set fruit. One difference between these two species is that the squash bees are out a lot earlier in the days than in the morning than honeybees. So you'll see squash bees active sometimes even as early as 4:30 a.m., just as dawn is getting going. And then you'll see their activity decline around midday. Whereas honeybees, you won't see as many in those really early morning hours when it's still cooler, and their abundance will increase over the course of the morning. In this study in Utah that Tepedino did, he found that pollination was complete by 8 a.m., which meant in that system, it was pretty much the squash bees that were doing all the pollination, even though there were honeybees there too, just based on their activity levels in the morning. What this ultimately means is that if you have a lot of squash bees on your farm, there's a good chance that you can get all of your pollination needs taken care of by those squash bees. And if you have low numbers of squash bees on your farm or no squash bees on your farm, then honeybees are a really great alternative. So, what do we see when we look on squash and pumpkin farms in terms of squash bees? We surveyed 37 fields, squash and pumpkin fields up in Yolo County, and found that a couple of fields only had or didn't have any squash bees. The majority of fields had 1 to 50 squash bees during our sampling period, which took about 50 minutes. And then we had 8 fields that had really high densities of squash bees. So I think the field with the most squash bees in it was a smaller organic field that had, I think, 459 squash bees that we observed. But I want to note that the second highest density of squash bees came from a larger scale conventional growers, and they, I think, had 408 squash bees in the transects that we observed. So, how do you know if you have squash bees on your farm? You can look for squash bees visiting flowers. Both the males and females visit flowers. You can also look for males in the flowers. They overnight in the flowers, so you can check flowers as they're wilting or squeeze flowers to feel for a buzz. Or you can look for their nest entrances, which are about the diameter of a pen. Sometimes they can have some soil around the entrance called a tumuli. Sometimes you don't see that. But these nests will be often underneath squash or pumpkin vines or near them. Honeybees and squash bees do look really similar. They're about the same size. They have similar coloration. But one thing that can help you tell them apart quickly is by focusing on their hind legs. And honeybees have these flat, wide hind legs that do not look very hairy. And at the top of those hind legs, there's a pollen basket or corbicula that moist pollen can pack onto. Squash bees, on the other hand, have really hairy legs that dry pollen sticks to. And so if you see a female collecting pollen, this is what you'll see, a moist pollen ball on the top of the hind leg of the honeybee or dry pollen all over the hairy legs of the squash bees. I want to talk about the squash bee life cycle for a second, because I think having a deeper understanding of the life cycle will give you some ideas of things to consider when you're managing for this bee. So, as you know, squash bees overwinter in the spring, overwinter from eggs to prepupa and emerge in the spring as adults. The female squash bee will look for a squash or pumpkin flower. Males will mate with that female and then go on to look for more females. Females will look for a nesting site, preferentially from where she came from or near squash or pumpkin. And when she finds a good nesting site, she'll dig a tunnel, put a cell at the end of that tunnel, and start looking for squash and pumpkin pollen to collect. She'll collect that squash and pumpkin pollen on her hind hairy legs and bring it back to the nest, and she'll deposit that pollen in the cell, and she'll keep doing that until she has enough pollen for one baby. So once she has enough pollen, she'll lay an egg on top of that pollen ball, cap off the cell, and do that process over and over and over again. And those cells are lined with a thin, waxy liner that protects the cell to some degree. If we focus in on that egg that she laid, that egg will hatch into a larva. That larva will eat up all that pollen and then overwinter as a pre-pupa. In the spring, that individual will pupate into an adult and then emerge as an adult, and that process will start all over again. And here in Northern California, at least, you'll see squash bees flying from early May, even into early October. So, with all the knowledge you have right now about their natural history and who they are, I just want you to think for a moment what aspects of farming squash or pumpkin might impact these bees. And you can jot it down on a piece of paper or just think about it in your head. What are some of the things that might impact these bees? So, when I and colleagues have wondered this, some of the things that came up on our list were crop rotation history, so the location of past squash fields in relation to this year's squash field. We also wondered about field level resources, tillage practices, and then pest management practices. And we're going to start by just talking about crop rotation history. So this is a study that was done where I'm based out of in Yolo County by myself and my colleagues. And we can imagine in this system that a squash bee might see a squash field like this and think, wow, this is a great place to nest. My offspring will be so happy when they emerge the next year. But unbeknownst to her, that squash field will turn into wheat and then even tomato before it goes back into squash. And this is a typical rotation for conventional growers up here in our region. So when we think about connectivity within this landscape or where squash bees might be coming from to colonize the field in which we're growing squash, we might think about connectivity to other squash fields within this year, within our growing season, and can call this within your connectivity. But we know that bees are actually coming most likely from where squash and pumpkin fields were grown last year. And so we can call this type of connectivity between your connectivity, or how connected this year's field was to last year's field. So we sampled those 37 squash and pumpkin fields that I told you about before. We set up 5 transects on each of those fields and spent about 50 minutes in each of those fields sampling all those different transects. And what we found was that there was a lot of variation um, in the number of squash bees on farms, especially when you mapped it out onto Yolo County. So this is the same data that I showed you before, but just mapped out onto the landscape. And you can see some of these fields had really low numbers of squash bees, and some of these fields had really high numbers of squash bees. So we wanted to know what was driving that pattern that we saw. And so we ran some models considering within your connectivity, between your connectivity, the size of the fields we sampled, and whether those fields were under organic or conventional management practices. And when we compared all those different models, what we found was that the 2 most important variables were between year connectivity, so how close the field was to last year's squash and pumpkin, and then field size. And if we accounted for the effect of field size and just mapped out squash bee numbers against between year connectivity, this is the pattern that we saw. The more connected you are to last year's fields, the higher number of squash bees that you have. So this suggests that one important management tool for this bee would be to consider the amount of squash in your landscape over time, and specifically if there's squash within a mile of where your field is located. That mile number, again, is based on what we expect the flight range to be of this bee. So what if you are, let's say, a smaller farm and you're always rotating squash within your crop fields? Are there other things that you can do? Or you're a larger farm in a high production area of squash or pumpkin. What are some other things that you could do? One question would be, can you do things around adjusting field level resources? And this was a question that Dr. Aide Guzman asked when she and colleagues sampled small farms. So these were farms less than 40 acres around Fresno, and they compared the number of squash bees on monoculture farms, so farms that only had squash and pumpkin, and the number of squash bees on squash and pumpkin in polycultures, so diversified farming systems that grew a number of crops. And in this picture here, you can see some corn right next to that squash and pumpkin. She and her colleagues found a number of things, but one of the things they found was that squash bee abundance was higher. They found more squash bees visiting flowers in these polyculture systems than in the monoculture systems. And this is sort of interesting because squash bees are really depending on squash and pumpkin. So you might think that just growing a lot of squash and pumpkin might be best for this bee. But in the context of this study, they actually found that growing more diversified cropping systems benefit this bee. And they had some ideas about why this might be. They thought it could be that there are additional floral resources, not squash and pumpkin floral resources that these bees might be using, for example, for nectar. Um, they also thought that it's possible that it was possible that these polyculture farms had fewer pesticides and less intense tilling than the monoculture farms. Um, I'm not going to go into this other study that she did, but I did want to flag it for you all because it was interesting. She also did some research looking at arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi inoculants on squash and how that impacted bee visitation rates. So just something to look into further in the future. So based on Dr. Guzman's work, another strategy you can use to support squash bees on your farm is to actually diversify the crops you're growing on your farm, at least in these smaller scale systems. So what about tillage practices? I'm sure this was on your list because it's one of the really big obvious ones, given that these are ground nesting bees. And in this image all the way on the right, you can see that what a cell of this bee looks like. I think there's a larva in that cell. Before I talk about the study we did, I want to first ask you how deep you think squash bees nest. So again, these bees are about the same size as honeybees. They're about a half an inch long. And I just want you to visualize how deep you think that bee might nest below the soil surface. Okay, so when we dug up bee nests, we found that most of the cells in those nests were located between 5 and 20 inches below the soil surface. So there were a few, cells in those top 5 inches. Most were between 5 and 20 inches, and then fewer going deeper than that, but some as deep as 35 inches. Um, uh, if you open up those cells, this is what you see. So these are pretty vulnerable little insects in these stages. The top left image is of an egg on top of pollen. That width is about a centimeter, just less than a centimeter. And then there's two images of the cell with the larva in it. And the image on the left shows what the cap of the cell looks like. So, to test the question whether tilling practices have an impact or how tilling practices might have an impact on these particular bees, we set up a trial where we put a bunch of cages over squash and pumpkin plants. And then we put two female squash bees and two male squash bees in each of those cages, made sure that they were nesting. And then at the end of the season, when they died, we removed the cages, mowed down the area after marking where our cages were, and then applied a tillage treatment. And that tillage treatment consisted of a 6-inch deep disc and then a 16-inch deep three shank subsoiler till, so more of a deep till. And when the implements rode over our control cages, they just lifted up the implements. And so that's how we got these cages that had these till treatment and then this control treatment. And this is a deeper tillage regime that's uh, something you might find on a conventional farm every 3 years or so up in our region. In the spring, we put the cages back where they were before, and then we set up traps in those cages to catch all the bees that were emerging from the ground that had been overwintering in their younger stages from the bees that had nested there prior. And what we found was that earlier in the season, there were more bees. It looked like there were more bees emerging in the control sites than in the till sites over time. And this is total bees caught across all the cages. And when we ran the statistical analysis, we found that there was some evidence that tilling was associated with decreased offspring emergence. So there was an 89% probability that emergence is lower in tilled cages than in control cages. And when we accounted for the impact of squash variety, because some of these cages had different squash varieties grown in them, we found that there were actually 50% fewer bees in tilled cages. And so that's a lot of bees getting potentially knocked back by tilling. And that's also a lot of bees surviving tilling that may not be within direct contact of the tillage equipment. Maybe they're nesting deeper or nesting in between where those where the chisel plow hit. Um, so this study suggests that one other thing you can consider if you want to manage for squash bees is the depth of your tilling practices, and when possible, just minimize tilling depth. And so to end with, I'm going to talk about pest management practices and how that might interact with squash bees. This part of the talk is going to be a little bit different. It's not going to be as much of a deeper dive and is going to be more of a general overview. And partly that's because of the studies that are out there. Um, but so let's get into pest management practices. So one of the most obvious potential issues between pest management and squash bee management is exposure to insecticides. And bees can be exposed to insecticides through direct contact, through indirect contact, and then of course you can also spray their nesting areas, the ground, by accident. So if you do use insecticides, including organic insecticides, you always want to use best management practices when it comes to pollinators. And these are also found on the UC IPM website. I know Cheryl's going to post a link to that in the chat box, but in general, some of the best management practices include knowing what bees are out there, following label instructions and calibrating equipment, of course, avoiding insecticides that are toxic to bees, especially broad spectrum and highly toxic insecticides, avoiding spraying during bloom when bees are flying, and avoiding directly spraying nests or, in the case of honeybees, hives. And again, you can look for additional best management practices for pollinators and insecticides on that UC IPM website. If you're a conventional grower, I also want to mention that you want to avoid tank mixing with fungicides. And then you also want to be really careful with the use of neonicotinoids. And for more information on neonicotinoids and squash bees, if you didn't hear it a few months back, Dr. Susan Willis-Chan gave a great presentation on the research she's done looking at how that particular insecticide group impacts squash bees. And we're putting the link to that in the chat box too. And yeah, again, that's for for conventional growers. Of course, regardless of whether you're a conventional grower or an organic grower, chemical controls are really meant to be a last resort. And so I want to focus now on some cultural or agroecological controls for one particular pest and how they might interact with squash bees. And the pests I'm going to focus on are cucumber beetles, in part because they are an early season pest in squash and pumpkin here in the region where I'm in. When the crop is getting established up here, if you can get situations where you have really high densities of this pest, and then that can lead to defoliation of your plants and hinder establishment. These pests can also create scarring on softer squashes like zucchini. I am going to be covering a lot in a really short amount of time. And so I want to mention a couple of other places you can go for a deeper dive into practices to control cucumber beetles. We're putting those in the chat box too. And one presentation I want to highlight in particular, especially if you're an organic grower on the call or organic PCA on the call, is this presentation by Ellie Andrews. She's the North Bay Specialty Crops Advisor, and she just posted an hour-long presentation on cucumber beetle IPM and has a lot of great details and examples in that presentation. So for more details, go to these locations. But for now, we'll just do a quick crash course, a reminder. As I'm sure you're all aware, up in this region of the spotted cucumber beetles that exist, the western spotted cucumber beetle is the most prevalent. This is a generalist beetle that feeds on a lot of different types of crops and plants. They can be found all over the plant, including the flower. They have about 3 generations a year. They lay eggs in cracks in the soil near plants, and then the larvae feed on the roots of those plants, and they'll overwinter as adults. The western striped cucumber beetle is the other main cucumber beetle you'll find up in this region. They are specialists in the family Cucurbidaceae, so they have a broader interest in cucurbit crops than squash and pumpkin plants, squash bees. These beetles, these western striped cucumber beetles, in addition to squash and pumpkin, will also go to melon and cucumbers, and they're especially problematic in melons. They're really good at hiding on plants, but you can find them on leaves and flowers too. They also have about 3 generations per year. They lay their eggs preferentially at the base of cucurbits because their larvae feed on the roots of cucurbits, and they overwinter as adults. Now, there are a number of different cultural control methods that can be used to help manage these pests. And I want to mention a couple of things about this suite of cultural control methods. So one is that most of the research out there has been done on the East Coast and with the striped cucumber beetle found on the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains. But we think that a lot of these strategies can also apply to California cropping systems. Another thing that I want to mention is that none of these methods are a silver bullet, and none of these methods will completely control cucumber beetle, but they can help you manage this pest when used in combination. Um, but it's still a struggle. These are just really hard pests to control because of how large and hard-shelled they are. And then the last thing I want to mention is that some of these strategies are going to make more sense on smaller acreage farms than really large acreage farms because they just become cost prohibitive. But some of the strategies include cultivar selection, crop rotation, transplanting instead of direct seeding, intercropping, using trap crops, knowing your natural enemies, using natural mulches, using floating row cover, and then you can also vacuum or physically remove the beetles. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about a couple of these items where there's been either some research or there's known potential interaction with squash bee management and cucumber beetle management. So cultivar selection is something you can use for cucumber beetles. There's not a lot of work looking at squash bee preference for these different cucurbitous species crops, but there is some information out there, for example, suggesting that squash bees prefer blue Hubbard squash over butternut squash. But at the end of the day, there's just not a ton of research out there for this particular strategy. Crop rotation is one that's an obvious conflict with what I was just talking about in terms of squash bees. You want squash bees to have access to squash and pumpkin every year. And if you're trying to control cucumber beetles, you'll want to disrupt the amount of squash and pumpkin and other cucurbits in the landscape to try and minimize the populations of this crop. Crop rotation really makes more sense for striped cucumber beetles because it's the specialist. And in fact, it's unknown really how well it works because these beetles are such strong flyers. And from what I could read online, it sounds like they might be able to fly a lot farther than squash bees. So that's just a trade-off that you'll have to decide for your farm how you want to consider squash bees and cucumber beetles in the context of crop rotation. Intercropping and trap crops have also been found to benefit squash bees and also help suppress cucumber beetles. In terms of trap crops, there was a study showing that blue Hubbard could be used as a good trap crop for butternut squash. And the yields weren't impacted by the main crop. They used fewer pesticides, and the squash bees still visited the main crop too. If you use a trap crop, you want to seed them typically at least 2 weeks before your main crop to draw the pest over to those crops. There's also some research out there on natural mulches and squash bees. They prefer natural mulches over things like plastic mulches. And then in terms of floating row cover, I wanted to mention that there's some research out there where someone actually caught squash bees and threw them under the row cover, and the crop was able to get pollinated by those squash bees under the row cover, and they were able to keep cucumber beetles off that crop and get good yields. So that was a whirlwind tour of cultural controls and how squash bees might interact with them. I'm happy to talk more about them during the Q&A, but that's all to say that when we think about pest management practices and squash bees, it's important to take an IPM approach and consider bees when you're managing for your pests. And with that, I just want to say thank you to you all for being here today and spending some time learning about squash bees. And I'm happy to stay connected by email or to answer any questions you have. I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and put your contact information in the chat
Great.
again.
Thank you.
We do have a few minutes and we have a few questions, so we can go ahead and go through those now.
Great.
So one of them that came into the chat, so I'll do that one first. Can you give the definition for pollinator management?
That is a great question. So I think if you think about that IPPM framework that I was talking about, pollinator management would include thinking about the landscape factors that might affect the number of pollinators on your farm, the field level factors that might impact the number of pollinators on your farm, using monitoring tools to determine if you have enough wild pollinators or if you need to bring in honeybees, and then using that to make choices about the amount of honeybees you need to bring into your farm. So pollinator management is sort of considering all the aspects that go into crop pollination on your farm.
Okay, thank you.
Mm.
And then there's a question from Joseph. What did squash bees live on before the advent of intensive farming in the California Central Valley?
Yeah, so there is one wild cucurbita species that's out here and found in some parts of California. And the research that's been done on this bee shows that they originated in Mexico and Central America, and then they initially followed the natural range expansion of wild cucurbita species. And then squash bees then started following the domesticated range expansion of squash and pumpkin plants by native peoples, especially on the east of the Rocky Mountains. In California, native peoples didn't really rely on squash and pumpkin. So in California, we think they were really relying more on those wild cucurbita species before they got to expand with the amount of squash and pumpkin grown for consumption today.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
And then there's one from Robert. Do squash bees pollinate other plant families? Are there
Mm.
any major native host plants? The only thing that came to mind was coyote squash.
Yeah, I think is quite coyote squash the common name for cucurbita. Oh, I'm gonna mess up the
So
it's
in the Q&A it says palmata.
Yeah, so it's a different the cucurbita squash excuse me, the wild cucurbita that I'm thinking of is a different cucurbita species. So it's Foetididsma, Foetidismosa, something like that. I can send out an email about it later. But so squash bees will rely on that particular cucurbita species. Um, uh, but really they need that or cultivated squash and pumpkin pollen to persist in the landscape. Squash bees will pollinate other crops. I know there's some research showing that they can contribute to watermelon pollination, but I think they're going to be the most effective in squash and pumpkin just because they're so tied to that particular crop.
Okay, and then there is one, do squash bees have stingers?
Yeah, squash bees, like all bees, all the female bees have stingers. They're modified ovipositors. So all female squash bees can sting. I've never been stung by a squash bee. I've handled a lot of them. Male squash bees cannot sting. They don't have a stinger. So if you are able to identify and find a male squash bee, you can even hold it in your hand if you wanted to.
Okay, and then the final question that we have, I know you reviewed the life cycle
Mhm.
of the squash bee, so I don't know if you can give a just a quick review of it again. And the second part of that question was, if they survive the flowering season, where
Mm.
do they disappear?
Mm. Yeah, so that question was probably asked before I talked about the life cycle. But in general, the bees emerge in the spring as adults. They are collecting squash and pumpkin pollen and building their nests over the course of the summer. The adults die at the end of the summer, and what's persisting in the landscape is her offspring, and all those offspring are below ground. So those offspring are developing during the rest of the year and then emerge as adults again in the next spring. So those adult bees that disappear are just dying because that's the end of their life cycle. And then, yeah, I think that probably best answers the question.
Okay, thank you. Actually,
Yeah,
that is all of the questions that we
great.
had. Thank you so much for your presentation. I want to thank everybody for attending. This was really a great
Mhm.
presentation. So I appreciate you coming on and presenting for us.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me.